Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us here at the Art Institute of Chicago. My name is Miguel Perez. I am the Associate Director of Engagement Programs here at the Art Institute, and I am thrilled that you are all here today to hear about the artist Lygia Pape from Adele Nelson, our esteemed guest. Before we begin, if I could please ask everybody to silence your cell phones. And at the end of today's program, there will be an opportunity for Q&A. We'll have two staff members carrying microphones up and down the aisles, so if you have a question after the lecture, please just raise your hand. Adele Nelson is an assistant professor at the Department of Art and Art History at the University of Texas, Austin, where she also serves as associate director of the Center for Latin American Visual Studies. She is author of Forming Abstraction, the Art and Institutions of Post-War Brazil, and co-organizer of the exhibition Social Fabric, Art and Activism in Contemporary Brazil, which received the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts Grant. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome me in joining Adele Nelson.
Hi, everyone. Happy Saturday. Thank you for being here when it's so beautiful outside and you have far better things to be doing. I'm honored to be here. It's been an incredible pleasure professionally to get to see Marc Pascal's incredible work on the show that's on view, Lygia Pape Tesselares, and I came up to Chicago and saw all the prints in the exhibition when they were in the research stage, and it's just been such an honor. Lygia Pape's work has been central to my thinking since I was in graduate school, and I really appreciate the opportunity to come back to her prints with different questions. I also want to thank Lizzie Ginsburg and Miguel Perez from the programming department for the invitation and all the coordination of my visit. And lastly, I'd like to thank Maria Cristina Rivera Ramos, the conservator who worked with Marc on the exhibition, as well as Kit Shields in publishing. So the talk that I'm giving today is drawn from the essay that I wrote for the exhibition catalog, titled Gender and Genre, Lygia Pape's Self-Fashioning in Print. Following World War II, media and art institutions in many industrialized and industrializing nations treated women as the ideal consumers of modern art and design. And here you see a very famous image that appeared in Vogue with Jackson Pollock painting in the background with a model in the foreground. This was also the case in rapidly developing 1950s Brazil. For example, in this image of a display advertising an art exhibition along with clothing and accessories sold at a high-end department store in downtown Rio de Janeiro, then the federal capital. And this store was in a landmark Art Deco building, and I've been thinking about it as I've walked the streets of Chicago the last day. It was a very grand building and a prominent storefront. What at first seems like a straightforward scene is in fact mired in the discourses of class, consumption, gender, and race that controlled the reception of art in Brazil and everywhere. White female mannequins donning pearls and gloves pose as both art admirers and as objects of admiration themselves. A male viewer in a suit on this side of the image, cropped and in shadow, takes in the scene. Is he contemplating the artworks? Is he appraising the clothes, jewelry, and perfume for sale? Or is he perhaps consuming the visual spectacle of the elegant stand-ins for women? As a woman artist, Lygia Pape risked being similarly objectified. Women artists were prominent in Brazil following World War II and served as both protagonists and faces for the new art and expanding consumer culture. So here I'm showing you an image on the right that I'll spend some time with today of Lygia Pape from 1955. And on the left is an image, kind of a comparable image to the Pollock image I started with of a model, a debutante, in fact, posed in the midst of what's considered to be the first exhibition of non-objective abstract art in Brazil, the Rupture Group in São Paulo in 1952. So the trouble for women artists in Brazil at this moment in the 50s is being taken seriously as makers, not just as spokeswomen for this new aesthetic. From Pape's position as a white middle-class woman working in the visual arts, a field associated with wealth, She traversed societal divides between working and non-working women and between consumers and producers of art. And in many ways, she perfectly performed the role of a spokeswoman for modern Brazil, even exploiting this position to the benefit of her career. And here are two of many images that appeared in the daily newspaper in Rio of Pape posed both in front of her own work, but also in front of other art buildings, art scenes in 1950s Rio. But through her printmaking, I want to suggest today, Pape also expanded and subverted the expectations for women artists. In the woodcut prints that she produced in the 1950s and early 1960s, as well as in her accompanying writing and self-presentation, Pape dove into the material and conceptual capacities of printmaking to create visual spaces of intersection and contrast in which sight and touch, word and image, and I will suggest today, woman and worker, form unexpected novel relationships. In her 1960 poem book, Poemas Xilogovuras, or Poems Woodcuts, Pape literally bounds the genres of printmaking and poetry together. So this is the cover of the poem book, which is on view in the exhibition and has only recently kind of been studied in relationship to Pape's woodcut prints. As you'll see today, it was prominent in the early 60s, but then kind of disappeared from view. So I'll just walk you through some of the images of the poem book. So we open with two words, and then we begin to have these juxtapositions of poems and woodcuts. And finally, the last page where she juxtaposes the words poems and woodcuts and signs her name. In her writing about this work, Pape turns this space on the last page. So down at the bottom here, the word poem is here and the word woodcuts is here, and we have this big expanse of white paper in between. In her writing about the poem woodcuts, Pape turns this large white space into a dash, a grammatical tool, a piece of punctuation that suggests both joining and separation of the two genres of poetry and printmaking. The work, poem and woodcuts, resist their linking even as it juxtaposes them. This idea of a break, of the relationship through rupture, connection through distance, continued to inform the artist's work long after she stopped making prints. So Pape lived until 2004 and had a long, prolific career, multimedia career, and I'm just gesturing towards a few works here. On the left are two performance and participatory works from the 60s. The Egg, which is a video and a performance where she literally ruptures a white cube with her own body and breaks through. And on the bottom left is a performative participatory work called Divider, where sheets are sewn together and holes are cut, and then people's heads, in this case children, go up through the holes. So we are both together, but we are divided. And then the beautiful Tetea work in the exhibition on view, where filament, wire, literally connects space across a void. This active joining together of elements builds on the processes of assembly intrinsic to Pape's approach to printmaking, in which she cuts, carves, abuts, adheres, and prints distinct wood grains and shapes. As Brazilian scholars have established in their foundational work on Pape, and as the present exhibition demonstrates so beautifully with its in-depth study of Pape's materials and techniques, the artist innovatively redefined printmaking. And this redefinition was repeated and revised over the course of her entire career. So she has a corpus of work that bridges 50 plus years, and she continued over the course of her life to position woodcuts as a conceptual foundation of her artistic process. So she's only making prints from the early 50s until 1960, but she continues to come back to woodcuts throughout her career. So this is just a sprinkling of examples of those. So the top left is a poster for a beautiful show of her prints that she organized in 1975. There's the cover of an artist's book she did in 1983. And then on the bottom right is one of my favorite images, which is Pape on a tractor from the retrospective of her work that she authored that she created in 2000. And this image of this carved hill is the image that opens the section about her woodcut prints. So she's continually reinventing how she thinks about her woodcuts throughout her career. Her most significant reimagining of the prints occurred in the late 70s and the early 80s when she retitled the works, which were originally presented with the titles of woodcut or sometimes composition or untitled, as tesselares, which is a neologism that roughly translates to weavings. Today, I'm going to trace the connections between the less studied start and end of her woodcut period. So these are some examples of the prints that she created in the early 50s, from about 1952 to 1955, and then the poem Woodcuts book that I showed you earlier. Pape's rhetorical and photographic self-fashioning during these moments reveal how she negotiated the gendered ways in which the public imagined the producers and consumers of abstract art. So Pape's redefinition of printmaking and her self-fashioning as an artist occurred as Brazil reimagined citizenship following World War II, as the country shed a dictatorship of Getúlio Vargas in 1945 and returned to democracy. It was a moment after World War II in which Brazil fought on the side of the Allies and had troops on the ground in Italy. It was a moment of rapid industrialization accompanied by an expanding urban middle class and consumer culture. As I discuss in my recent book, the art world that fostered a boom in abstract art in the two largest cultural centers of Brazil, Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo, was defined on one hand by a host of new modern art entities, the best known of which is the São Paulo Biennial, the second longest running biennial exhibition in the Americas. It was founded in 1951. And on the other hand, by the contested relationships between these new modern art institutions and young artists. Artists formed artistic groups and took up the term concrete art to describe their abstract practices free of ties to representation or figuration. The term concrete art was initially coined and promoted by European artists Theo van Doensberg and Max Bill to describe an art devoid of any reference to the natural world and composed of geometric forms and focused on mathematical and scientific relationships and rhythms. So I'm showing you two seminal works of concrete art in Brazil by Geraldo de Barros and Lygia Clark. Both of these paintings are painted with materials that are tied to industrialization. So they're painted with car paints, essentially, enamel, and they're on these what we call in the US masonite boards, these compressed plywood boards, and they're composed, as you're seeing, solely of geometric forms, and our role as the viewer interacting with works of art like these is to engage them perceptually. An artist that was of this group described his work as visual ideas, so our engagement with them is meant to be completely devoid of any reference to representation or illusion, and about perception and psychology, as well as, for some of these artists, thinking about mathematical principles like the Mobius strip and things like that. Following World War II, the expanding news press in Brazil lauded women's status as increasingly enfranchised and visible citizens, although class and racial barriers, along with patriarchal values, persisted. Women in Brazil had won the right to vote in 1932, the second Latin American nation after Ecuador and the fifth in the Americas after Canada, Jamaica, and the United States to extend suffrage to women, although myriad and extensive barriers existed in all those contexts. So I'm showing you here this amazing map from a Uruguayan feminist from 1929, where she delineates who has rights and who doesn't. And in the South America, you can see there's like a blip in the northeast of Brazil where one state had given women the right to vote, and a small blip in the southern cone where one city had extended rights to women. There's also an image of a leading Brazilian feminist leader from the 20s and a photograph of workers' activism that I'll talk about in a minute. But let me pause to note something that's distinct about sort of voting rights and constitutional rights broadly in Brazil versus the way we tend to think about them in the United States, which is that the Brazilian constitutions, all of them, from sort of the Empire Republican moment to our current day, never had racial discrimination or gender discrimination on the books. So unlike Jim Crow laws or other laws in the United States, the place of social injustice has to be found in the application of the constitutions, not the words of the constitution themselves. Lots of other social identity categories are used as stand-in for racial discrimination. So literacy is one of the ways that individuals were disenfranchised. So in relationship to women's rights, in Brazil, the limits on women's voting rights were explicitly tied to education, labor, marital status, and implicitly to class and race. So for example, in 1945, voting became obligatory for working women, leaving women who did not work outside the home with the right but not the requirement to vote, which is the category that Pape would have fallen into in the 50s and early 60s, where she was working as an artist but didn't get a paycheck from any institution. Women played a prominent role in the fight for workers' rights, and that's this image on the bottom right is a very famous strike from 1953 called the Strike of 300, in which predominantly female textile workers led labor actions that resulted in better workers' conditions in factories across São Paulo. It was not until 1962 that married women legally could work without the permission of their husbands, and only in 1965 did voting become compulsory for all literate women, regardless of their marital or employment status. And I pause on these facts because my generation in the United States tends to forget how precarious voting rights were in the middle of the 20th century, and to highlight that even as a privileged white woman, as Pape was, that her rights were very incomplete as a young artist in terms of her enfranchisement. This system of yoking enfranchisement to social identity is the background against which I think we have to understand the representation of women artists. Media portrayals of women as citizens included new visibility for and growing acceptance of professional women. And the concrete art group in Rio that Pape helped create in 1954 was very central to the view of professional women in the Rio press. There were 3 women artists in this group, Pape, Lygia Clark, and Elisa Martins da Silveira, and each of them figured prominently in cultural imagery of women workers in Rio, which I mentioned in passing at the beginning was then the federal capital. So they were central to federal images of sort of what a woman worker constituted. Pape was consistently identified in the press as a gravadora, the printmaker, and developed a reputation as the sole printmaker among Rio and São Paulo artists who adopted non-objective practices. So this on the top left is an early work, rarely seen, from 1952. That's her early figurative work where you can pick out trees amongst the bands of parallel lines. And then an example of kind of one of the far ends of her experimentation in woodcut printing from 1959, where she's printing with a whole myriad of stuff, drilling into wood and printing those gridded holes. Following World War II, print workshops and graphic biennials proliferated in Latin America, where printmaking was often hailed as a technique suited to the developing economies. Prints were relatively affordable to produce and disseminate compared to paintings, which required expensive imported oil paints, and they had an established practical and political applications in the region. The medium also had a lauded history, for instance, the Taller de Gráfico Popular in Mexico, as well as the work of Oswald Golgi in Brazil. Amidst this renewed interest in the art form, Brazilian artists like Fagia Ostrafer produced multi-hued, technically expert prints and received international praise, which included winning the top printmaking prize at the Venice Biennial in 1958, and this is a work in the Art Institute's collection. Although Pape participated in this boom of printmaking post-war in Latin America and even studied with Fagia, she criticized what she saw as the prevailing rarefied definitions of the medium in the Brazilian arts scene. So she saw her woodcuts as resisting any kind of like highfalutin sense of printmaking and its technical capacities, and as getting down to kind of a lo-fi schematic printmaking. I've learned from Mark and Maria Cristina that there's a lot of technical virtuosity involved in these woodcuts, but her rhetoric was one of that she wasn't participating in this same kind of overly fancy sense of printmaking. Pape's approach to printmaking also resisted convention. She did not systematically sign and date her prints at the moment of creation. Over the course of the 50s, she stopped consistently indicating edition size or proof number and began exhibiting impressions of the same images with different mountings. So this is the same print. She exhibited it differently in 59 and 56. She also dated the same work with different dates. So one of these works is dated 1957, the other one 1959. These choices paradoxically resulted in multiple originals. In part because of the distance she asserted from mainstream printmaking practices, she was commonly referred to not just as the printmaker, but also as the only concrete printmaker in Brazil. Pape was able to sidestep some of critics' sexist dismissal of the many female printmakers operating in Rio and São Paulo. Her insistence on the medium's parity with painting and sculpture and ultimately poetry gained increasing traction among other concrete artists, as well as art critics. It was, despite the centrality of printmaking to her practice in the 50s and early 60s, and as I've alluded to, something she returned to over the course of her artistic career as kind of a conceptual foundation, it was nevertheless her jewelry designs that first received solo press attention. In December of 1954, Pape's jewelry was included in a celebration at the Museum of Modern Art in Rio, and the press praised her enamel and copper brooches, earrings, necklaces, and explicitly gendered and patriarchal terms. They talked about husbands coming and purchasing things. So the central image is an artist who's wearing Pape's earrings, and in the image on the right, Pape's wearing one of her brooches that she designed. A month later, Pape receives, again, made news, this time for the release of a print portfolio of 10 small format colored woodcuts in an edition of 20, 2 of which are included in the exhibition here. There was a lot of press coverage of this portfolio, raving about the print's quality and bargain price. And the photograph that accompanied some of this coverage is the one you're seeing on the right and that I promised you I would return to. She is pictured wearing a brooch of her own design, smiling broadly, and holding a portfolio. The photograph with her portfolio, I think, illustrates the tensions that recurred in the cultural press then as it does now, in which artists gendered as female are regularly showcased alongside new art and design pieces, including their own, donning stylish outfits coordinated with the work on hand. Here, as in a number of other photographs of the artist in the 50s, she wears a dress of a vibrant pattern, perhaps deliberately selected as an eye-catching backdrop to make her jewelry visible. So this is another well-known image of Pape from 1955 with that abstract art group she helped found, Grupo Frente, and then a color photograph of one of her brooches, so this sort of brushy enamel application that her jewelry deserves a lot more study than it's received, in my opinion. So I'm in part including this just to flag that in case any of you are interested in design and could take this up. This image presents Pape as both the maker of the prints and the customer of her own production. The overall effect is of a beautiful coordinated tableau, down to her coiffed hair and cheery expression that casts the artist as spokesmodel. Such images of Pape with her own work coexisted in subsequent months and years with photographs of her at openings and cultural events in front of artworks that were not her own. Pape, along with other women artists, thus served as an elegant embodiment of Rio's vibrant cultural scene. Pape did take steps beginning in the mid-50s to control her own public image. Her husband, Gunter Pape, photographed her making works repeatedly over the 1950s. One of the photographs he made served as a headshot in an exhibition catalog, but to the best of my knowledge, none of them were published until late in the artist's life or posthumously. Still, they provide us important documentation of Pape's working processes In some of these studio photographs, she wears fashionable outfits that coordinate with her art. So they still kind of walk this line between woman as consumer and woman as producer. But these photographs by her husband notably foreground her labor and not her face, and center her fingers pressing against her work or her body hunched over a collage on the floor of her studio. It was via the prints themselves that Pape most fully constructed and asserted her status as creator. In 1955, her prints were featured prominently alongside sculptures of nationally renowned artist Maria Martins at the 3rd São Paulo Biennial. So these are Pape's prints here, and these are Maria Martins sculptures. So let me zoom ahead now to talk about the sort of this late 50s, early 60s moment. So the attention Pape received as the only concrete printmaker increased in the late 50s, as did the precision of her marks and the geometry once she eliminated the color inks that we're seeing here and began experimenting with larger formats. Her presentation in the press, so these are some of these late 50s, early 60s moments, early prints, but her presentation in the press, she continued to be photographed as this kind of idealized consumer, but there was a new venue for creative expression in the press, which was the Sunday supplement of the Jornal do Brasil, a daily newspaper in Rio. And there, instead of photographic portrayals of exhibitions, we get these silhouetted images of works of art. So no longer photographs of the artist, but instead illustrations of her woodcuts, cropped to the edges, silhouetted, and set into a graphic design of sparse page layouts, came to also be part of the press reception and visual representation of Pape's work. This kind of representation and other scholars, Irene Small, Sergio Delgado Moyo, have talked really insightfully about the graphic design of this Sunday supplement and how artists dialogued and in some cases influenced artist-owned practice. And I think the sparseness of the graphic design of Jornal do Brasil has a lot to do with what Pape does in poems and woodcuts, where she uses space to kind of think about the tensions and the juxtapositions that she's trying to articulate. So, as I alluded to before, in 1960, Pape produced her final major print work, Poems, Woodcuts. Besides marking the culmination of a decade of in-depth experimentation with the woodcut medium, the project reveals how the artist productively maintained and conceptualized fissures in her multimedia practice and her identity. The mix of media, one visual, the other textual, was also an explicitly gendered juxtaposition because post-war art critics in Brazil and in other contexts had deemed printmaking as a predominantly female discipline and therefore minor compared to poetry's masculine power and relevance. So when Pape produced this Poems, Woodcuts, she had published several poems in the Sunday supplement of the Jornal do Brasil and became recognized as the only female concrete poet in the exclusively male Brazilian concrete poetry groups of São Paulo and Rio. So if I'm going out on the limb that I have built for myself, I hope, I'm thinking that this juxtaposition that Pape does in 1960 between poetry and woodcutting could be read as a complex salvo against misogyny. The work does not equate the art forms, but instead that maintains their differences even as it brings them together. So the context for this print poetry book also includes the founding, which Pape participated in, of a new avant-garde group in 1959 in Rio called the NeoConcrete Movement. The group argued for a new art that remained grounded in the geometry of concrete art, but focused on transforming the viewer from a passive spectator into an active participant. So as the group's manifesto put it, and it is illustrated by a woodcut by Pape in the top right there. As the group's manifesto put it, their artworks address the viewer as an I body rather than as an I machine, a mobile, feeling, social being rather than a static, purely rational observer. And the first participatory work that Pape created, which she debuted in 1960 at an exhibition of the NeoConcrete group, is called Book of Creation. But she exhibited in that exhibition, the prior and the subsequent NeoConcrete exhibition, prints as well. She viewed prints as also doing this work of turning the viewer into an eye body rather than an eye machine. So another way of putting that is that this work, which is made up of panels that are painted in gouache, and you see black and white images that appeared in the newspaper of viewers physically handling this unbound book, that those phenomenological, sensorial, participatory experiences she also felt were relevant to the two-dimensional spaces of printmaking. And she explicitly, in the 1960 and 1961 NeoConcrete exhibition, juxtaposes the Book of Creation with the poems Woodcuts. So here is one of the beautiful installation views that we have of the exhibition of the NeoConcrete group in São Paulo in 1961, their final exhibition. And this is the poems Woodcuts on the wall under glass panels, and on the long panel in front is the Book of Creation. The poem book is unbound and housed in a folded folio printed with a black outline of a square. The inaugural page, which the reader accesses by folding back two flaps of the folio along a centered vertical cut, reads, "On breaking reveals." Pape thereby endows the gesture of pulling back the cover with transformative potential, narrating the act of opening the book as a breach that reveals. She also suggests a meaning for the work's title. The poems and the prints are not equivalent. Instead, in a chasm between them and in their adhering together, something is revealed. In a text published during the second NeoConcrete exhibition, Pape described the book as composed of two distinct parts, poems and prints. She wrote, quote, "The two side by side lose their expressive independence in favor of another catalyst, which encompasses both parts, merging them together into new content." Pape thus eschews the long-standing proposition that visual art conjures an ineffable experience for its viewers in favor of underlining the experience of the spectator reader, who negotiates and merges unlike things. Following the first page, the sheets of poems Woodcuts are folded in half, and the reader must open each to view the conjunction. So the reading experience, when we were allowed to touch these things, not so much now, but back in the day, the reading experience thus entailed encountering repetitive blank white squares that one physically opens and closes again. The order of the poems is flexible. It is an unbound book, and it's been exhibited in many different orders. So I'm going to read through the poem in the order that I studied it in 2017. So, "On breaking reveals, in shout, field, in light, lime, grind, in grain, on green, names, thread, river, mouth, full to wander, of wind, of time, in echo, chalks, in the middle, it rotates. In reverse, steel. Steel, keel, blue. The wheat fields, the same ones. In green, endures. And finally, in shout, field, and light." The second and the last poems are identical. In shout, field, and light. Their company prints share the same composition, triangles jutting out from four corners. But in the first one, the one on the left, the triangle planes are filled in with in the earlier one, they're empty, and on the right side, they're filled with black printed ink. So I think, I'm zeroing in on one poem just for the sake of time, but matched with these geometric streamline prints that do not seem to have anything to do with the words, these opening and closing poems evoke an animate presence in nature or a multisensorial experience nature, the sound of a shout, the physical location of a field, the feel of light. The final words, in claro, can be translated as in light, as I said, but they can also be translated to awake, describing a state of consciousness of whatever being has uttered or heard the shout. So the poem is notably absent any pronouns. There's sort of this like speaking or uttering, but no attachment to who or what is doing the uttering. Considering the poem Woodcuts alongside Pape's prints of the first part of the 50s, I think provides us some insights into how the materials of and meanings of printmaking informed her conception of the break. So the image on the right is one that I had never seen before, the research for the show here at the Art Institute, and was so overwhelmed to see, which is a print from 1957, so 3 years before she realizes the poem's Woodcuts, with the poem written down at the bottom, the wheat fields, the same ones. So, you know, the poem's Woodcuts is a 1960 poem, but as is true of Pape's career as a whole, she's sort of churning through these things, returning to them over the course of many years. In a beautiful text that Pape wrote about her printmaking, she described how prints form, quote, an invisible weft that is very expressive through its proper techniques, whites, lines formed by the mismatch of fiber, scratch blacks, etc., end quote. The pioneering manner in which Pape sutured different materials, forms, and disciplines makes legible a neglected but crucial fact of the transformation of viewership that abstract artists enacted in Brazil after World War II. Friction rather than resolution prevailed. Difference is held together provisionally. That this was also the social and legal condition even for a privileged woman like Pape in Brazilian society at the time is essential to grasping the stakes of her media juxtapositions. By establishing herself as the singular concrete and NeoConcrete printmaker and the sole woman concrete poet, Pape both considered and countered her portrayal as an active sideshow in the art world. The break she first explored in printmaking was also a means of expressing and subverting the limits placed on women artists, the means by which she fashioned herself not as a consumer but as a creator. Thank you very much. And as Miguel signaled at the beginning, I'm more than happy to answer any questions, talk more about any of these amazing works. Miguel and Lizzie are in the aisles with microphones, so if you'll raise your hand if you have a question. I actually can't see y'all very well from up here, but it looks like there's one down here.
Why do they use the term concrete for their group?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So there's multiple layers to it. One, so as I said, the term was coined by Theo van Doensburg in 1930, so a style artist, Dutch artist, and then taken up after he died by Max Spill, who was a Swiss designer, architect, teacher, all of the things, who had studied at the Bauhaus and helped found a Bauhaus in Germany after World War II. And Bill did a lot of promoting of the term concrete art in the interwar years, during World War II in Switzerland, and then after World War II to Latin America, to Argentina and Brazil. He eventually travels to Brazil multiple times in the early 50s. For Brazilian artists, the term concrete art allowed them to assert a place in European modernism. So the NeoConcrete Manifesto that I showed during my presentation, there's the Pape print at the top right. If it looks like this, maybe has been disenabled. Here we go. I'll go back to it rather than, bear with me one sec. There we go. So the Brazilian artists are up top, and the European artists are down at the bottom: Max Bill, Albers, Pesner, Malevich. So adopting the term concrete art is a way that Brazilian artists were able to assert that they were responding to, innovating within a tradition of European modernism. The larger context for that is that, you know, the benefit of the doubt is always sort of given to artists in the center and hegemonic centers of New York or Paris or Berlin and Brazilian artists and Latin American artists writ large, or artists of the global south writ large, are often assumed to be derivative or belated in their artistic practice in relationship to those artistic centers. So Brazilian artists are asserting equity and asserting equivalence with European artists by adopting the term concrete art. It is also perpetuating a centering of Europe, right? But does that answer your question? Yeah, that's a good question. So he asked if there was a relationship to architecture. So there was. The term concrete isn't a term, at least to the best of my knowledge, that's used in architecture, but the fact is that many of these artists were utilizing industrial materials, were explicitly trying to position their work as ultra-modern, futuristic products. What to my read, occurs by the late 50s and early 60s is that the abstract artists become quite frustrated with the equivalency between what they're doing with international style architecture. So Brazil, after World War II, as I kind of gestured to with those building images of São Paulo as a city of skyscrapers and highways, Brazil is an emerging global power after World War II, and its modernist architecture and its art is being promoted abroad. And eventually, in the late 50s and early 60s, artists and art critics start issuing sort of critical text about the way that how architecture is being shown as kind of the postcard for economic policies of the country, and they want to distance themselves from that easy kind of equivalency between what they're doing and developmentalist economic policies, as they were referred to in Latin America at the time. So, but that being said, a number of these artists collaborated with architects to make murals. So there was a relationship for sure, and some of the publication venues that art criticism happens in are also design, architecture design. So there's a lot of relationship, but artists did come to really want to distinguish what they were doing with concrete art from international style architecture. Thanks for those great questions. I see another person there.
Hi, thank you.
Oh, hi, Sergio. Sorry, it was very disembodied, your sound coming at me as I was, pardon me. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for a great talk. That was marvelous. I really appreciate this, such a rich context that you gave us to keep thinking about Lygia Pape's work. And I was especially appreciative of your focus on printmaking and on those connections you made between printmaking and social movements. And you mentioned during your talk that reference of Taller de Gráfica Popular.
Yeah.
And I was thinking too of sort of printmaking as it started being explored in places like Chile in the post-World War context. And
Yeah.
with those two contexts in mind, I started wondering whether there was any sort of excuse the word, concrete connection, but just concrete connection between some of these printmakers in Brazil and social movements or workers' movements of the kind of connections that you see in places like Mexico, the Taller de Gráfica Popular publishing for a sort of like an art market, but also contributing very richly to posters, to the kind of print matter that a workers' movement would need. So basically the question is there, do you know of any connections either by Lygia Pape or other printmakers in Brazil related to her work to these kinds of sort of movements?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. To my mind, no, with Pape in the late 50s and early 60s, like this moment that I'm focused on. She does, as you know, start making prints for movies in a later moment in her career and is more politically conscious and involved in resistance to the dictatorship after 64 and her own imprisonment. So, but there are, so the print circuit that she is circulating in and the one that is getting visibility in the Sunday supplement of the Jornal do Brasil is a fine art printmaking circuit that is for circulation in art, fine art exhibitions. The kind of any concrete connections between her and other printmakers in a regional sense is that she is participating in these Brazilian art and South American art printmaking shows that are being produced in Latin Abroad, or works are being borrowed by the Pan American Union and sent. So she is circulating in kind of Pan American circuits, her prints, but there are, of course, printmakers who are contemporaries of hers, not in that kind of like Museum of Modern Art and Rio circuit, who are making prints in association with politics. And I'm trying to think of people off the top of my head, but I will think about it more. And right now at UT, there's a beautiful exhibition of cordel literature. So there's a long tradition of woodcut prints in Brazil for like chapbooks, and those are very tied up with social justice movements from the ones that we own at UT Austin are from the 30s until the present. But it's a good question. I'll think about it more. Thank you, Sergio.
Hi, one thing I was wondering was going back to the jewelry. I was just curious, like, were the pieces for like purchase or consumption by people at the time, or was it rather just for viewing?
Yeah.
And if they were for purchase, like, do we know if like the price was reflective of some of the values she emanated by, such as like equity and just power to women? And like you said, that balance between like consumer and producer.
Yeah, they're really understudied and they need to be studied, but she was selling them. So that like weird image of those disembodied heads with the jewelry from the newspaper, those were on sale in a Christmas sale at the Museum of Modern Art. And she and others, they're like, the Christmas season was an occasion for a lot of artists to sell like Christmas cards and postcards and in her case, jewelry as well. The only one of her jewelry that I've seen in person was given by her to one of her students who's a friend of mine. And I think my impression is that a lot of them remained with her. But I think your question raises a important maybe like clarification or elaboration I should make, which is that Poppy at this moment that I'm studying in the 50s through the early 60s, talking about in this talk, was not actively involved in any feminist or women's rights movements. So I think she's grappling with her position as a woman artist and countering the way that she's being represented and asserting, right, her role as the sole concrete and the NeoConcrete printmaker, and then the sole woman poet. That being said, both Poppy and other contemporaries of her, Lygia Clark, most notably, are kind of are swept up in like electoral politics at the time. So like Lygia Clark's interviewed in the newspaper about who she voted for president. So another member of this abstract artist group. So I'm making the argument that Poppy's negotiating her status as woman artist, but she wasn't actively an activist at this time in her life. That comes a bit later in terms of resistance to the dictatorship that I was alluding to, that she begins to sort of more publicly state political opinions. Any other questions? Thank you so much.